This is Gordon Vanderspey, coolest last name ever. It's live at 2 a.m. in South Africa. What part of South Africa are you in?
Okay, so I live on the southern tip of South Africa in a place called Gordons Bay.
Perfect.
And I'm basically surrounded by mountainous trout streams filled with ravenous trout that just want to eat dry flies. And so that's kind of like what I love doing. I love fishing dry flies, and that's what I do. And my closest stream is 10 minutes away. I can be on a stream in 10 minutes fishing. And yeah, that's kind of, I'm an actor by trade, so that's what I do. But being an actor, you're not always working, so you've got time for a lot of things. So I tie flies, I run an expo in South Africa, a fly fishing expo here. I illustrate, I write for magazines. Thanks, Rocky. Rocky, thanks, my man.
Rocky just said he loves Gordon's book, which is, I've got to say, I have a copy, and it is a spectacular book. I'm genuinely excited about tonight's presentation. Anyway, keep going.
There's Jonathan. See, all these guys, I've met them on Facebook and spoken to them, but I've never been able to have a proper dialogue with them. So yeah, no, cool, Jonathan. I'm glad we could do this, and thanks to April for hosting this session. And I think it's going to be cool.
I'm excited.
So yeah.
Tell us about so what's the story and philosophy behind it?
Okay, so basically I almost didn't write the book because, there have been 5,572 fly tying books have been written, and most of them all sort of sing the same tune. They show you the recipes, they show you the step-by-steps, and I thought to myself, does the world really need another fly tying book? So I almost didn't write it, but then something said to me, you know what, you do have something to say. And I believe if you've got something to say, say it. If you don't have something to say, don't say it. So the idea behind the book is it's based on one very simple premise or one simple idea, and you can sum this whole book up with this one idea: form follows function. Okay, so basically, figure out what you need the fly to do, and then design it and tie it to do that. So you're not just blindly, following patterns or recipes. You're actually thinking about it, and that's basically what the book does. It takes you through that journey. It just opens up your mind. You're not going to know everything after you've read this book, but you are going to start asking certain questions, and it'll take you on this journey of discovery. Because for me, that's what it's about, the process. It's not just about catching fish. It's about, getting there, getting to that point, what it entails, the people, all of that. Fishing to me is very much like it's a family thing for me, I view other fishermen as family members. And even though we come from different walks of life and we do different things, I mean, there are people that I meet and converse with that I would never normally mix with, in like everyday life, like lawyers and politicians. And these are people you wouldn't mingle with, but you've got one thing in common, and that's fishing. And that's what binds you. And I don't know if you've noticed, but the fishing community is very helpful. We help each other,
Yeah.
So that's been great for me. I love that. So basically, I wrote this book, and hopefully I've helped people. Let's see. The proof of the pudding is in the eating,
Right. Brian Larson says, great book from Wisconsin.
Oh, Brian, thank you, my man. Thank you.
Well, let's dive right into it. Let's have a look at what's going on in that brain of yours.
Okay, so let me tell you how the whole thing started. So I'm standing in a stream. Okay, I'm about, 13, 14. I'm standing in the stream, and there's this guy on the opposite side of the current, and we're both nymphing. and we're nymphing for yellowfish. And this guy, how's it, Bianca? Yes, a South African chick right there. Donkey, thank you. She stayed awake. Yes. Okay, so I'm standing in the stream and we're fishing. And this guy on the opposite side of the current is hammering fish, like he is bolting them every cast. And I'm catching nothing. I'm like, not a single fish. And after about 20 minutes, I get frustrated and I walk over to him. And I say to this guy, I said, you know what are you doing? And he says to me, show me your fly. And I show him the fly and he looks at it and he says, ah, that's the problem. He takes out a piece of split shot from his pocket. That was still in the day when we didn't really have tungsten. So we used to use lead split shot. And he crimps it onto my tippet with his teeth. And he says to me, try it now. And I cast it, first cast, boom, fish. So he says to me, it's quite simple. The current here is very fast and our drifts are very short. And these fish are hugging the bottom just to survive. So if you don't get the fly down immediately, they probably won't even see the fly. So as soon as that fly hits, it needs to be right down in the zone. And he says, and if you do that, you're going to catch fish almost every cast. And I did. But then that got me thinking. Our job as fly fishermen is to present the fly to the fish. Now, presentation is everything. If you can't get the fly to the fish, you're not going to catch the fish. So whatever you do when you tie that fly needs to be geared towards presenting the fly. Okay. So 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in an art class and we're learning about a guy named Louis Sullivan. And Louis is the father of the skyscraper. Okay. And he coined this phrase, form follows function. So basically figure out what you need the thing to do and then build it to do that. So the skyscraper, they didn't have a lot of space, you know, to make offices flat. So Louis went, well, let's go up. So form follows function. Another example of that would be a car wheel. A car wheel is round. Why? To facilitate continual movement. I mean, if the wheel was square or triangular or rectangular, it wouldn't move smoothly. Why? Because its design doesn't allow it to do that. So basically, I was listening to this guy talking about all this stuff, and I thought to myself, hell, this stuff can be applied to fly tying, you know? And up until that point, I'd been doing the thing that everyone does. I'd been reading the books. I'd been reading the patterns. I'd been following the step-by-steps. I'd been doing all of that. And all of a sudden, my head opened up. For the very first time, I started asking questions. Why am I tying in this tail this long? Why am I tying it in that short? How does that affect the way this fly performs? And I basically threw out what I'd learned up until that point, and I started thinking differently about it. I started thinking about the science of flies, of what makes this thing do what I need it to do. You know, what makes a fly float, for instance? Is it buoyancy? Is it buoyant materials? Is it structure? You know, what makes a fly float? And what makes a fly present in a certain way? You know, if I'm fishing a hopper, I might want it to plop, and that's a definite trigger because hoppers plop when they land. So then I'd tie it with something that would make it plop and float, obviously. Sometimes you don't want it to plop. Sometimes it needs to land very gently. So then I've got to tie it to do that. So for the first time, I started looking at that. And the funny thing is, my fly tying actually got simpler. You know, I started simplifying things. For instance, I think personally, most of us have way too much gear, believe it or not. You do not need 3 tons of fly tying material to tie effective and efficient flies. I mean, I don't know about you, but I think, okay, I fish mostly streams, but I think I fish 8 patterns. Mm-hmm. That's it. You know, you've got your favorites. If I ask you, April, if someone put a gun to your head and said, right, April, if you don't catch fish today, you know, we're ending it. You only allowed having 5 flies. You know exactly what you're going to be fishing. Okay. So for me, I've simplified things, and that's basically what this whole thing is about: simplification and making sense of it. You know, it all makes sense. There's no mystery in this. There's like none whatsoever. This makes total sense. You go to any guide, okay, or any competitive fly fisherman, and you ask them to walk you through their fly box. They can basically explain and motivate every single fly in that box. They'll tell you when they're going to fish it, where they're going to fish it, and how they're going to fish it. And that's the thing. And that's what makes a good fisherman good, is they know why they're doing something. You know, very often we think of ourselves as being an external force to the environment we fish in. We don't realize that we're actually part of the environment. You're part of the food chain as much as the brown bear is, or as much as the heron is. You are part of that food chain. And what good fishermen do is they basically slot into that. They become aware of their surroundings and they read them. You know, they look at what's happening. They're not just mechanically doing something. If you're just casting the whole time, doing the same thing, and you're not getting fish, why? Why? That's like going to a pub and asking the same girl for a dance 10 times, and she says no every time. Why would you do that? Makes no sense. Yes. So what you've got to do is you've got to be asking yourself questions the whole time. And that is what really good fishermen do. And you don't need to be a brilliant fly tyer. You don't. Some of the best fishermen I know are not great fly tyers. I mean, look at guides, look at their boxes. Oh my word. It's not designer. It's not. Look, if you go to Blaine's box, it's designer. But like a lot of guys, like if I look at the South African guides, Christian Pretorius, Johan de Preer, James Christmas, you know, a lot of these guys. Nothing special, but they catch fish and catch lots of them. And they believe in the flies in their boxes because they've designed them for a specific thing. So yeah, so that's basically what my whole mission is about. I basically think, you know, I spoke about the whole form follows function thing. Every single thing on that fly needs to be motivated. So let me take you through a couple of examples of what I'm basically talking about. So let's have a look at, let me take you through this. Okay, so this over here is a damselfly nymph pattern I like to fish. So let's look at this whole concept of form follows function. If you look at the hook, okay, it's quite a thick gauged wired hook. Why? Because in South Africa, where we fish these things in still waters, you have bigger fish. So you need a very stout hook. If you look at the fly, it has plenty of inbuilt mobility. Look at the CDC fibers as legs, look at the marabou tail. So we fish these things dead drift most of the time next to weed beds. If we're going to move them, we move them extremely, extremely slowly. Okay, with like a slow figure of 8 retrieve. It's got all the triggers of a damselfly nymph: a long, thin abdomen, those legs, those alien-like eyes. Okay, so the thing is built to fish in a specific way. Most people, when they fish these things, they just retrieve them. But damselfly nymphs aren't moving all the time. So this thing is designed to just sit next to those weed beds, and you just drift it along in the ripple, you know. And then when you need to retrieve it, just a slow figure of 8. But you'll see it's designed to move even when it's not being retrieved, because these little CDC fibers are going to give you plenty of inbuilt mobility. So I absolutely love CDC in a fly. I just love it.
Can you try maximizing? Just try hitting up in the far right. Yeah, try that one. Let's see what happens there.
No, that's
the other way. Okay, gotcha.
Okay, so that's, sorry about that.
That's all right.
Okay, so that's basically, that's the natural, and that's basically the imitation. And realism isn't what's important to me. The important thing is that whatever you do, that this fly emulates a living creature and it looks like something that's living. Okay. Here's a little Mayfly nymph. Now, if you look at this little fly, longer tail, biot body with contrast. This is a macaw biot I've used here. Squirrel dubbing, CDC legs. Now, this is quite interesting. The way we fish these things is we fish them in pools. So now when the river is extremely low, we'll fish this under a dry. Now, this is fairly small. This is a size 18, and we'll fish this under a dry. I've noticed that with CDC, those CDC fibers move on their own naturally, and that's a major trigger. You know, even when you're not retrieving the fly or anything like that, they move. They give the fly inbuilt mobility, and that's quite an important thing. The bead helps you just to make sure that fly just sits under that dry fly. So this is something we fish in Lesotho, and it's basically just built for purpose. You know, I could have called my book Purpose-Driven Fly Tying, because that's basically what it is. Everything in this thing is you know, motivated. You'll notice this bead is silver. Sometimes you don't want flash, you know. It's quite a contextual thing. Sometimes flash helps you, sometimes flash doesn't. But there are ways to deal with that. Like the one way to deal with flash in beads is you can always burn this thing. And if you burn a bead, I'll show you what happens to it. If you look at, where's my burnt? I don't have it on here. But if you burn a bead, what happens is it goes like a dark gray color, okay? So you take all the flash off it. So if you don't need a flashy bead, and sometimes you don't want one, then that's exactly what you do. You'll see the hook is once again quite a thick gauged wire hook. Why? Because the fish we're catching are very, very big. These things over here, yellowfish, and they're extremely powerful. They're like European barbel. So you need a hook that can actually function. If I used like a light wire dry fly hook, I might have problems. So I like to use Hamakatsu S10, 2 S's for my nymphs, and S10s for the dry flies. And I mean, I've caught some nice fish, like 30-inch fish on like size 18 hooks. So they've been extremely good. If I look at this, okay.
So this is, you're saying, Gordon, to try Command F. I think everyone's trying to get you full screen. What happens if you press that blue button down in the middle with the square in it? Yeah,
this button.
What's that guy do?
Oh, we're done. Okay. Okay. I just don't know how to. There we go. Okay. So basically, if you look at this, this is like, my word. How do I?
Just go back with your arrows, or you can press escape if you want out.
Oh wait, I got it. April, you've actually taught me something now. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so look at this. Thick gauged wire hook, okay, foam. Thick gauged wire hook helps me. Now, this is a dry fly, but why would I use a streamer hook for this? To basically keep the hook orientated correctly in the drift. Because that foam is extremely buoyant and bulbous. So what will happen is the fly will literally flip over if I didn't have the correct hook, okay? If I had a light wire hook. So very simple foam body. That wing over there helps me see the pattern nicely. I've got legs. If you look at that, very definite X effect. So that helps with the profile. I mean, that's a very, how do I pause this thing? It's a very definite thing, you know. Also, to separate these legs, I do something. I basically put a little bit of dubbing in there, and I whip finish right behind the head with a little bit of dubbing, and that increases the angle of the legs. Now, the reason I do that is when I twitch this fly, his legs move, The minute I leave the fly, they come back to this position over here. And that's quite an important trigger, you know, especially when you're fishing this fly, and a fish will come up, and very often you'll just give it a little twitch and he'll eat it. That will just be the thing that he needs to motivate him to eat that fly. Okay, now there's a little trick I like to use, and a lot of people battle with this. You've got to plan the fly, okay, and that's quite an important thing. So what I like to do is run a thread base, use a permanent marker, and mark out where I'm going to put my specific body segments. Now, this is quite a cool thing because you can get every single fly exactly the same by doing this because you've planned the fly out. So on this hopper, for instance, I would use 1/3 of the shank length for the head, 2/3 for the body, which I divide in 3 sections. So I can get those same proportions with every single fly. It's consistent. Why? Because I've planned it like that. And that's something I actually learned from classic salmon tying, is to plan flies like this. You'll notice this fly's got the basics. It's got a body, it's got a wing, it's got legs. The triggers are movement of the legs and that profile. And it sits in the surface film like a hopper should, not on top, in. Okay? If you look at this, something totally different. No weight, no bead, long tail, lots of CDC. So you've got a lot of resistance on the sink. So this fly will have an almost neutral buoyancy. This is the type of thing I'd also fish on still waters. I think this would do well in like, you know, any place where you've got buzzers, mayfly nymphs, that kind of thing. If you fish it on like a washing line rig, it's got jungle cock over here, which is quite a nice trigger or highlight. You know, fish can see this from a mile away. That nice little red head, inbuilt mobility. I mean, these fibers just move on their own. A little bit of flash, you know, light wire hook, not too heavy. So that's built to have a neutral density. You don't want this thing sinking fast. It's a very slow, gentle way of fishing. Okay, now let's look at this thing. This is called a Pedigon. And if you look at this thing is designed like a teardrop or like a raindrop, okay? Very short tail, very few fibers, nothing. It's basically just thread, a little bit of paint, and a tungsten bead. And there is nothing on this fly that offers resistance on the sink. The whole mission with this thing is just to plumb it down at pace. So there's no life-giving movement in it, nothing. But when you're fishing fast currents, fish don't have time to look at a fly. So your main thing is just getting it to them. And that's the important thing, getting a fly in the zone. And if you can do that, you will pick up fish. So that's where something like this works very well. It's all a very contextual thing, you know. Like I said before, you fish to the situation or conditions in front of you. You know, so this Pedigon might be great in faster water, but in slower water might be totally useless. This is not something I'd hang under a dry fly in a pool, for instance. It's got no inbuilt mobility. It's not that kind of fly. But once again, extremely simple, extremely useful. So yeah, I've basically just explained everything. Okay, so yeah, something different. Does that other fly with the CDC, and this is what I hang under the dry flies. Okay, so I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm semi-blind. Okay, and one of my very favorite flies to fish is something called an F-fly. Okay, but I battle seeing them. Now, F-fly is just basically CDC wing, a little bit of dubbing. But I battle seeing them. So what did I do? I put a post on mine with a little bit of hackle. Now, see that post is trimmed at an angle like that. There's a reason for that. See how light reacts to the tips of those fibers. It basically reflects off it. So you can see this fly easier. Also, being trimmed at an angle, if the angler is looking from this direction over here, you have a larger surface area to actually look at. And the nice thing about the hackle is generally with CDC flies, after 3 or 4 fish, you've got to replace the fly. With the hackle, you don't have to do that because the floatability of a fly isn't just dependent on the CDC wing. That hackle helps you, and it's a lot more user friendly than CDC. So this is something I tie in, and it's something that's extremely effective. Once again, extremely simple. You know, it's not going to win fly tying competitions. He has a kink hammer outside with a macaw by it, so you've got contrast, a little bit of squirrel fibers over there. Same story, mixing hackle with CDC. Now, the problem with hackle is hackle's very good, right? It's stiff, so it helps a fly float well because it gives resistance against the surface film. But the one area where it's very bad is it doesn't have any movement. It basically almost got no movement. It's extremely stiff. So I work in CDC fibers, and I find in slower currents, in slower water, this version is way more effective than a normal clink, simply because I think it gives it inbuilt mobility. Also look at the way light reflects on the CDC, how it works with it, you know. Look at the hackle fibers. They simply don't have that same effect. Now, if you look at insects trapped in the surface film, and you look at the little hairs on their bodies and that kind of thing, when the light hits them, you get this very similar effect. So I think that's like a dinner bell. It's like a definite trigger, you know, building a little bit of CDC in the flies. I don't think you need to tie everything with CDC, but it definitely does have its place. Okay, so this is a South African pattern called a para-rab. This is probably one of the only flies in the world that uses squirrel tail as a halo. And you basically get this effect, okay? So where would you fish this thing? So look at that massive search image that you have there. You've got these squirrel fibers, you've got this coq de leon tail, you've got a pliant body, you've got all that hackle over there. So this thing floats extremely well, great in faster water. Why? Fish can see it from a mile because it's massive. But also, these fibers here give you a lot of movement. They literally move because they're so long, they're moving in the drift. And that I like these things hammerfish. They just hammerfish. My friend Philip Mayer came up with this fly. This is, all the Australian guys will know this. This is like a Walker's killer, or my version of a Walker's killer. Look at the profile of this fly. I mean, you look at that and you immediately think little minnow. You know, it sells itself. Very simple, very effective, not hard to tie. Yeah, if you look at this profile, whole profile, this is a South African pattern called a wolf spider. So those legs just sell it. I mean, a fish sees this and it immediately identifies, boom, spider. And fish will travel long distances to come eat these things. Okay. Size. Size is a very important thing, you know. Very often in high pressured waters, you'll find that smaller flies tend to outperform larger flies. And I'm not just talking freshwater now. I'm talking Atlantic salmon, I'm talking tarpon, I'm talking trout, I'm talking steelhead, I'm talking, you know, one would think that a big fish just eats big food. And yes, they do. But especially when there are lots of anglers around and fish are pressured, they'll very often eat things which are very small. And that will just, like, you know, they just love that. Okay. So another thing I like to do is to plan a fly. So during lockdown, I tied a couple of streamers, and that's something I never do. It's not, you know, I fish dry flies most of the time. And basically what I started doing was drawing them. And I know Bob Popovics does this too. You put the hook on the page and you draw the fly around it. And then you can literally measure materials on your drawing and see where you're going. So you see the fly before you've even tied it. This thing is another example of form following function. You know, if you look here, it's only got six bundles of bucktail that you've tied in, okay? But you still have a massive profile. It gives you a bigger bait fish. Also, look at the spaces in between the bucktail over there. This allows that head to compress quite well when you pull the fly. So it gives it a lovely action. So you have the bulk, the illusion of bulk, okay? But you still use less material. It's a fantastic fly. It's really, really wonderful. And it's so well thought out, and it's simple. It's not hard. So this is like a version I tied of it. It's a very simple version. It's nothing special. I probably should add some eyes to this. It'll be better. And yeah. And then there's something in fly tying called the domino effect. Okay, so if you look at the tail of this fly, this is just like a catskill pattern I tied. If this tail was tied shorter, okay, what would happen is this fly would topple over in the drift. It wouldn't sit like this. Why? Because you wouldn't have enough weight in the back to support the weight up front. So basically, it doesn't matter how well you tie the fly. If the tail's too short, it won't fish properly. And that's an important thing to remember. You know, even with things like woolly buggers, if the tail is not tied solidly on top of the hook shank, the fly will not move optimally. So that's quite important, is to make sure that you get every single step right. And everything has a reason. The tail is that long. Why? To support the weight of the front. And so you've got even weight distribution. There's like perfect balance in that fly. Okay, so let me do this. Let me get to this. Okay, now what I want to do is I need to get to this video. Oh my word, how do I make this thing smaller? April, I'm battling to make this thing smaller. Yeah.
Press the escape button.
Escape. Where are they? Escape. Okay, wait, I've just gone out of screen share. Let me get there. Okay, great. Okay, so. Okay, let me stop this. So what I want to now do is I just want to go through a little damselfly nymph tie. And I just want to explain a couple of key principles in terms of the actual tying that have helped me and that I use a lot, okay? So one of the main things in fly tying, and it's something that's sort of sometimes misunderstood. Can you see everything? Can you see it, April?
Oh, are you playing the video right now?
Yeah, I've stopped it. I've paused it. Can you see the image?
No, but remember, so stop sharing, and then when you share, click the little tiny box for optimizing videos.
Okay, wait, let me get that. Sorry.
And David's just messaged asking if I can send it the recording of the session. I think I can, David, but it won't be loaded on the site for a few days. It's also going to be up on anchoredoutdoors.com. So just head on.
Okay, so we've got it. Can you see it now, April?
Gotcha, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So one of the most misunderstood concepts in tying is the concept of thread control. When you wrap thread, okay, every time you wrap thread, you introduce twist into it, okay? So basically what you've got to do is every now and then you've got to counter the twist. You've got to untwist your thread. So if you look at this thread here, I'll wrap it. Every now and then I'm untwisting it. And I'm using the tag end of the thread to lay the wraps down evenly. This is something I do for most flies I tie. I lay down a thread base. And I do that, why? So that I can seat materials on it. If I just tie materials onto a blank shank like that, they're going to move around when the fly's in use. So if you want a durable fly, you lay a base, okay? And I normally lay it with a light colored thread for 2 reasons. Number one, I can make markings on this to help me in terms of placing things on the actual hook. Number two, if I got dubbings and stuff, when the fly gets wet, they'll remain true to color. If this was darker, they might go a bit darker. So that's the reason I use a light colored thread. I don't think you need 5 million spools of thread. I personally use 3. I use Griffith Shear 14/0. I use Danville's 6/0. And for really tiny things, I use Unitrico. Okay, so that's mostly for my trout stuff. If I was fishing saltwater, I'd use other things too. But I have 3 spools of thread, light colored like this. If I need to color them, I use permanent markers. Okay, so I lay a base of thread, just like that. And now look at this. Take the thread back, take a permanent marker. There we go. And I mark exactly where everything needs to be. That's going to be the head of the fly. That over there is going to be the thorax, and that's the body. And this helps me tremendously because now I know exactly where everything needs to be. If you don't plan this, sometimes you make the thorax too big and you don't have enough space for the head. Beginners typically battle with crowding the eye of the fly. So what you could do is make a little mark there and just never go past it, and you won't crowd the eye. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is tie in a tail, some marabou fibers. Okay. I wet them at the points, okay, with a little bit of spit. Spit's important stuff in tying, people. I cut them, so now they're easy to tie in. And then using a pinch strap, I tie them on top of the hook shank. And that's quite important. You don't want the tail rolling over or anything like that. The next thing I do is I tie in copper wire. Okay, and I tie it in at an angle. Why do I tie it in at that angle? I tie it in at that angle because it's trapped against the hook shank. So that material can't roll anywhere. You're going to tie it in first time. And I give myself more material than I need. I tie it in and then I pull it to the correct length. Okay. And then I wrap this in together. And why am I wrapping it in together? Very important. So I use less thread. I want to keep this fly extremely thin. It's a damselfly nymph, okay? So I've got to think about bulk throughout the process. Look at the thread here. Look how flat that thread is. I'm consciously thinking of flattening that thread the whole time. Okay. Next up, I tie in a couple of marabou fibers for the body material. But look what I do here. I select marabou that's extremely tapered. So at the tips, extremely thin, and it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. I tie it in. I put some spit on this to keep these fibers together, okay, just to help me out. Tie them in, pull them to length, bring my thread all the way back. Notice it's flat all the time. And then I just wrap these fibers, wrap them away from me, and they're quite fine. So I do something called a wrap and a trap. I wrap them, trap them, wrap them, trap them. And with any fine material, that's a very effective way of doing it, you know, because it gives you time to collect the material in your dominant hand to continue the wrap. So wrap, trap, all the way to my tying point, and boom, tie it in. And you can see that taper, that nice taper I've created over there, okay? Now there is a slight problem with the body as is, and the problem is this: durability. If a trout's teeth hits that, those fibers are going to unravel. So what do? We use our ribbing to secure that, and I rib in the opposite direction, and that basically traps those marabou fibers in. they aren't going to come undone even if a trout's teeth do hit them. So the prime function of that ribbing is to make this body more durable, but it also adds something else. It gives us contrast. If you look at the blue against the green, it just makes the fly show up quite well. And that's quite an important thing too. Okay, just tie that in, finish it off, boom, back to my mark. And now I'm going to tie in some Swiss straw. Okay, and I use a soft loop or soft wrap, tie that in very gently, okay, on top of the hook shank, and now I dub. Okay, now dubbing. Dubbing is extremely simple. Dubbing is like making candy floss. Basically, when you put the stick in the sugar, and it's got that sort of tornado thing that distributes all the sugar stuff, it goes in one direction. So with dubbing, distribute it evenly along the thread, and then wrap it on in one direction, and do small amounts. Don't try and dub the whole thread, smaller amounts, because it's easier to add dubbing, than to take it off. You can always add more. Okay, so add more dubbing. There we go. All the way to our first mark. Okay, now the next thing, I'm going to tie in some legs with the CDC. And to do this, I'm going to need to split this thread. But that's quite a simple thing to do. All you do, okay, is you flatten the thread. Now notice here, I've got the thread on a fingernail. And that flattens the thread even more, okay? And then I can basically just poke it with the needle and split it. Put a finger in there, insert my CDC in, okay? Put it over a finger at a sort of a 90-degree angle and just spin that bobbin holder. Now, the reason I do that is if I just let this thread hang, these fibers would spin up on themselves, and you don't want that. You basically want a bottle brush effect. So that's important that you have a 90-degree angle. Now what I do is I basically brush and wrap. Brush back the fibers, wrap. Brush them back, wrap. Brush back, wrap. And that gives me, if you look at this nicely now, a nice swept back look. Okay, so you've got all these little fibers here. Next, I pull over this wing case, the Swiss straw. I tie it in, 2-3 wraps at most, and then I give a couple of locking wraps. Now, locking wraps are extremely important. What they do is they take the tension or the pressure off the tying point there, and they displace it. They put it on that hook shank over there. Like another place where you'd use locking wraps would be like the wing on an Alcaire caddis. Okay, so you tie the wing in, but then instead of whip finishing at the tying point, you'll prop the thread up in front of the wing, and that'll displace that. So then the wing won't move around because the tension is now on the hook shank. Okay, and then over here, I'll tie in some eyes. This is melted mono, and I'll use a couple of figure 8 wraps. And that's just very basic, figure of 8 wraps. So you can see that, and I'll tie those eyes in. What I should actually do is put a drop of super glue right there, just to secure all of this. I didn't do it here, but I would advise it. And then I like to dub, but I don't dub in a figure of 8. I dub around individual eyes, okay? And what that does is, that gives me a nice flat head profile. If you look at damselfly nymphs and dragonfly nymphs, they've got a flatter heads. They don't have these big, fat, bulbous, round heads. So I really like that. And then I put the Swiss straw over, tie it in, cut this off, and I put in a half hitch. And the reason I do that is just to ensure that this doesn't slip out, okay? And then I cut off the excess material, put a little bit of, in this case, Sally Hansen's, but super glue would be even better. put a bit of super glue on the thread, okay, and I whip finish. And what that does is, that gives you what I call an impregnated whip finish, because the glue is inside the head of the fly. It's not just on the outside. So it gives you a stronger head. And then you basically cut it off, and that's basically the fly. Very simple. So there's basically nothing to that. And I know this is very dense and there's lots of information there. But if you look at all of that, it makes total sense. It's extremely simple. I mean, if you look at those principles and you carry them through, it'll make a lot of things you do a lot easier. And this is what a lot of people don't do. They don't get the nuances, you know. They just follow, but they don't, the small little details, they don't nail them. And it's not about doing something like spectacularly different. But there's nothing to that fly. That's easy. You can tie a pheasant tail nymph, you can tie that, no problem. So keep it simple, keep it motivated, keep it purpose driven, and presentation. Keep presentation in mind. Tie the fly to present it. And if you're doing those things, you'll become more efficient and more effective. And I think that's what people need to do. You know, don't just follow things. Don't just follow trends. I think of Frank Sawyer. You know, if you look at most of the patterns that people fish nowadays, that basically made a massive impact on us. Most of those patterns were not just tied because people were trying to tie patterns. They were tied because these guys or girls were trying to find solutions to a piscatorial challenge or problem. If you think of Frank Sawyer, who tied the pheasant tail nymph, Frank was fishing a pheasant tail spinner pattern, a dry fly, and this thing sunk, but it still took fish. And Frank went home and he thought, wait a minute, fish feed subsurface for 90% of the time. Now, traditionally, when you fish chalk streams, you wait for a fish to rise, you cast a dry fly to it, and it eats. But what if the fish aren't rising? And that happens. 90% of the day, they don't rise. So Sawyer went home and he thought, you know, let me create something that purposefully sinks. And people thought he was a heretic. They thought he was crazy, batshit, because he was doing something that was like, you just didn't fish a nymph on a chalk stream. That was like highly, that's like highly illegal. You just don't do it. But he didn't care, because he went, guys, this makes sense. These things are not on the surface the whole day. So let's take the fly to them. And that's what he did. And basically, with that one fly, he started something. I mean, he was, in my eyes, he's the father of modern nymphing. You know, that's kind of where it started, with that pheasant tail nymph. And if you look at that fly, April, that pattern hasn't changed much. Mm-hmm. It's as effective today as it was then. Why? Because he got one thing right, the design. The guy was a naturalist. He looked at his environment and he followed the cues. He didn't just read books and magazines. He read nature. And that's the important thing. You can quote me on that. I've got a friend, pheasant tail nymph, Prince nymph, my go-to patterns. Yes, Jonathan, that Prince nymph is fantastic. So he did that. I look at another friend of mine, Hans van Klinken. So Hans goes and he takes a curved hook and he ties a parachute hackle on there, and he ties this thing called the Klinkhammer special. Okay. And he hammers fish on this thing. He goes to the UK and the guys tell him, no, this thing will never work, because it's like a size 10. And our grayling eat size 16s. That's what they eat. And Hans goes there, and like a typical Dutchman, he hammers fish on the size 10 beast of a Klinkhammer. I mean, you look at that guy's fly box, it's insane. It's like these flies are scruffy and they're big. He's like a big or go home type of guy. There's no subtlety. It's just massive stuff, but it works for him. So most guys who tied patterns that made a difference basically broke the envelope, moved away from convention. So that's what I'm trying to say. Don't get stuck in what books or what everyone tells you to do. Think about things and try different things out. The best place to test or design a fly is where? In the river, in the lake. Let the fish tell you what they want. If it doesn't work, you tweak it. And you continue tweaking it until things do start working. Fishing and fly tying have a symbiotic relationship. You can't divorce the two. You need to understand something about fish to tie flies for them. You know, most people we live in the Big Mac generation. People want things instant. Like people will come for a fly tying lesson and tomorrow he'll want to know everything. It doesn't work like that. It's a process. They're building steps. You learn step for step for step. And I don't know why everyone wants to get on top of the mountain, but people don't want to, take the time getting there and seeing how cool things are around them. So for me, it's about the process, not just about the end product. Fishing is an extremely spiritual experience. To my mom's big dismay, I don't go to church that often, okay? But I do fish a lot. And I can't think of a better place to meet my maker than in the place he made. Quiet, him, me, fish, done. And that does it for me, personally. I'm not saying it's got to do it for you, but for me, that does it. So that's basically my whole approach, the whole way I think about things, Does anyone have any questions?
Oh, there will be questions, all right. I was absolutely, you had me transfixed on that fly. It was beautiful. If you have questions, go ahead and write them in the chat or in the Q&A. If you're on Facebook, go ahead and Jonathan's, you can read that. What is Jonathan saying?
I started by just copying designs. They work, but sometimes I wonder, let's go look at this. They work, but sometimes wonder, there are days where I can't get a look. After having my logic blown apart with your form follows function thesis, thank you, thesis, I noticed that I tried to get more approvals from other fishermen rather than just letting the fish let me know what works and what doesn't. Very true. Would you please send a recording of the session? Okay, it's on Facebook, David. I stand corrected. You are correct. Miss copied. Okay.
Oh, yeah,
Technically, it wasn't Louis Sullivan. It was Miss van der Rohe and Walter Gropius who invented that phrase. No, it was definitely Louis Sullivan. Okay, but you stand corrected. That's cool.
I don't think there's questions going up. I think, what about on Facebook? If you're watching on Facebook and you have a question about materials or philosophy or proportions, feel free to ask. I have a question actually, real quick on that.
Ask.
What's dip dyeing?
Dip dyeing. Okay, so dip dyeing is exactly that, where you take a fly, you tie the whole fly, and you dip it. So you just dye a part of the fly. I like dyeing. It's not something I'll do all the time, but I battle to get, like in South Africa, we battle to get decent bucktail, right? So if you're in the States, you can get a lot of decent quality bucktail. But if you live in Africa, it's a very massive problem to get decent bucktail. So when you get decent bucktail, you just dye it. But what I found is you can actually dip dye things, where in classic salmon tying, we do it a lot. We'll take a feather and we'll basically say dip it in yellow, then we'll dip it in black, and we'll dip it in, we'll dip it in, yellow and then red. And that'll be like a sub for Indian crow. So we'll get various colors on a single feather. You can do the same thing in a fly. You can dye it. So that's what dip dyeing is. You just dip it in the dye. Done.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I know on the drawing, you had all these different colors, and I was wondering how you were going to dip dye it to get that series of colors.
No, so basically all I was going to do is I was going to tie white on the bottom. I was going to tie light sort of a light green and blue, and then on top of that I was going to dip dye it like a darker color, just so the back's a dark color. So you'll have 4 colors. So it just gives you depth, basically. I mean, you don't have to do that. I mean, chartreuse over white, basics work. So yeah.
Dip dyeing. Anyone else have any questions? I'm amazed that I can see people watching, but everyone's so quiet. Everything's just sinking in right now.
Okay, so let's talk about something. Let's talk about the concept of proportion. Okay. So when we learned to tie in the 80s or the 90s or the 70s or whatever, you had these things called proportion charts. Okay. And they basically told you your tail needs to be that long on a nymph, your body needs to be that long, and they'd give you variations, but they were extremely rigid. It was very textbook orientated. So a lot of those proportions do hold true, and they are a very good basis for people, but you shouldn't get stuck on them. Okay. Proportion should be determined by the function of the pattern. So sometimes if I'm tying a small little nymph, okay, now a small fly like a size 20 nymph has a very small gape. But what I'll sometimes do is I'll tie that on a size 18, use less of the hook shank. So tie a smaller nymph on a bigger hook. So I have a bigger gape to hook the fish with, but I still get a small fly. Now that thing is going to look extremely disproportionate, but it's going to do what I need it to do. Give me a bigger hook gape, so a better chance of hooking that fish. So yeah, whatever you do needs to be like sort of aimed at the function of the pattern. And you can apply this theory or this concept to life, to anything. Form follows function. I'll give you an example. Nails. Do you have nails?
No.
Do you have long nails?
Not
Okay,
anymore.
so that's great. Why don't you have long nails, April?
Because I've been stressed out and I have chewed them down.
Okay, but if you were fly tying.
Oh, the best tool when I tie flies, I make sure I've got a couple nails because they are I push them. I use them as walls. I use them to slide my thread off. Yeah, I use them for everything.
So they're great, but you don't want nails everywhere. If you have I'm talking about these long nails. If you have long nails everywhere, it makes it very difficult. Also difficult to fish with long nails, So that's what I mean by form following function. So those very long nails need to go. Yeah, also in terms of materials, okay. I personally think you need to have materials which are versatile. I don't just buy materials in shops. Shops are good, but I source a lot of the stuff myself. So I'm very specific on where I get things from. CDC, for instance. If I want decent CDC, there's this guy in Czechoslovakia, David Jedlika. I get stuff from him. If I want just a massive bag of wild mallard CDC, I go to a guy in the UK, Steve Cooper from Cook's Hill. Now, when a pattern calls for something like CDC, not all CDC is the same. Different qualities of feathers are used for different things. So wild mallard CDC would be great for wings on like F-flies or wings on Spanish Mayflies, but wouldn't be good for split thread techniques, for instance. Like Pedigon would be better for that, or Swiss CDC. So I'm very specific in terms of what I use, and I know exactly where to get it from. Hackle. If I look at like dry fly hackle, I love using Seidling Hill. So these guys are smaller breeders, and they're not large corporate like operations. They're farmers, and they've got this on the side. but because they deal with smaller numbers, they can do different things. When you're big, you sort of like limited sometimes. So you get very interesting things out of these things. So yeah, I don't think you need 3 truckloads of materials. I have everything in a small toolbox, very small, and that's all I use basically for the type of work I'm doing.
Stan has a good question. He asks if there's any observation about hook size and type relative to the patterns.
Okay, so all a hook needs to do, okay, manufacturers will tell you what a hook must be used for. So they will say this is a light wire dry fly hook, okay? I don't pay much attention to those instructions. All I do is I look at the hook in front of me and I ask myself the question, is this thing going to be able to handle the fish I need to catch on it? Okay, so I'm not going to go to Lake Strobel, for instance, and use some light wire dry fly hook. I'm not going to do it. Why? Because it's just not going to work. It'll just bust open on me. If you go to New Zealand, for instance, you're not going to use some light wire hook on those big jacks. You're going to use something like a Black Magic. It's one of their local hooks. It's a stronger hook. Why? Because it needs to handle the fish. So that's the first thing. It's got to handle the fish. Second thing, it's got to support the presentation of the fly. So you aren't going to tie a delicate little dry fly on a thick wired nymph hook. Why? Because it will sink the fly, negating the entire thing's function. So think logically about hooks. You can even, and this is something we do in classic tying, we adapt hooks. We play with them, we bend them. You can take a light wire dry fly hook and you can bend it to create a jig hook. The only place you can't bend a hook is at its eye. It will break, but anywhere along the hook shank, if you bend it, you can bend it anywhere along there. It works. So you can basically bend hooks. You can do all sorts of crazy things. The important thing is to play. A lot of guys, a lot of people just follow what they read. The important thing with hooks is to test them and see what they do for you. If hooks open up on you, no good. You don't want soft hooks. Terrible. They need to hook fish well and they need to hold them well. And once again, like I said, support what you need, the presentation of the pattern. And those are the 3 things a hook needs to do. It doesn't matter what hook it is. If it fulfills those three requirements, it's fine. Yeah. So that's important.
Oh, sorry. Gloria is saying, don't you worry about the hook impacting the profile when using larger sizes or using larger size?
Not really. It's a funny thing. Hey? I don't think fish really look at the hook. It's the weirdest thing. It's kind of like if you go, okay, so I'm an actor. So if you go watch a puppet show, people doing marionettes, you can see people manipulating the strings, but after a while, you don't see the strings and you just look at the puppet. And I think hooks are a bit like that. You kind of ignore that they're there. And I think fish do that because if they didn't, we wouldn't catch anything. Think about it. If the fish knew that hook was there, would we ever catch fish? I don't know. So to me, that's not the most important consideration. I'm not too worried about that, as long as it just fulfills its function. Any observation about hook size and type relative to patterns?
That was the one. That was the one that I asked you earlier.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. So basically, I don't even pay attention to hook sizes, April, because they're not standardized. One hook maker size 16 is another hook maker size 18. This is the very reason I don't use hackle gauges, because now you've got a hackle gauge that says this is a size 18 hackle, but I'm using a hook that doesn't sort of match up with that. So I measure hackle on the actual hook I'm tying on. There aren't standardized, there aren't standard hook sizes, and basically when I look at a hook, I just go, is this thing the right size for the little insect or the mayfly or the whatever I'm trying to imitate? Keep it logic, you know. You've all been on a stream, you've seen the bug in your hand, you've gone, boom. Is the hook the same size as that thing? And that's what you need to be asking yourself. Don't get wrapped up too much in the theory of it. Just keep it basic.
I like
So,
basic. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to post them. In the meantime, Gordon, where can people find you and your book?
Okay, so I'm basically on Facebook a lot. I've got a group called the Feather Mechanics. Okay, and we post, there's a lot of content on there and a lot of interesting things, you know, where people can get materials. Like if you have a question, post it on there. We'll answer it, no problem. I've got a Instagram page, the Feather Mechanic. So I'm posting up stuff all the time over there. And I've got a website, www.feathermechanic.com. You can catch us over there. And you know, I like to talk to people and find out what they're doing, you know, and send me pictures of flies and ask questions. And April, I must tell you, where I've learned the most about fly tying is from the people I've taught to tie. Mm-hmm. You know, where you'll get a beginner, and because they don't really have a massive reference or a frame of reference, they do things which are sometimes like not textbook, but you look at it and you go, wow, that's quite cool. And you pick those things up. So there's a lot of things that I've picked up from utter novices, you know, and I'm open to that. A lot of people will think, oh, I've been tying for 30 years, I know everything. I can promise you, you do not. You don't. Because then and a lot of people also think, you know, there's that whole concept of the 10,000 hour rule. Have you heard that?
Oh, yeah.
You've got to do something for 10,000 hours to be a master at it. Well, I don't believe that. And I'll tell you why. Because there are enough people who play golf who've been doing it for 100,000 hours who are still crap at it.
That's a good point.
No, think about this. You get these kids, okay, who've been tying for 3 years, who in 3 years know more than someone who's been tying 30 years. It's not just about the time. It's about the intensity of the energy you put into it. So if you get, like, there's a kid at the moment that I occasionally help, a South African guy named Daniel Dwayne. He's 16. He is a phenomenal fly tyer. And he's a kid. He's been tying for 3 years. But why? He's a sponge. He sucks up all the information, and he's constantly, and he's focused, you know. So that's the main thing. And I mean, you don't have to be a brilliant fly tyer. I mean, you don't need to be brilliant to tie flies that catch fish. You just don't. But yeah, so the intensity you do it with, I think is quite important. Personally, for me, I just like tying flies. You know, it's kind of like, some people like gardening, some people like watching soap operas on TV. I like fly tying. It just sort of shuts the world off, and I just go to my happy place. And yeah, I just love it. Just love it.
No, I love it. I love the way that you think. Yes, Stan, feathermechanic.com. Stan's saying it didn't come up. Is that right? Feathermechanic.com?
I think it is www.feathermechanic.com, or it could be www.thefeathermechanic.com. Try one of those.
Try that, Stan.
Try that, Stan.
And I've got another question for you here on Facebook when you have a sec.
Yes.
Rich is asking, is there a general shape of hook that you're attracted to more than others, particularly regarding holding fish better?
Okay, so I think in terms of holding fish better, I don't want a hook with too long a shank. These massive shank lengths, I think, give the fish leverage, and I think you you drop a lot of fish on them. So sort of a standard shank length. If you want a longer fly, you can always adapt the time to get a longer profile. There are ways to do it. But a shorter shank, and you need a decent gape so you can hook the fish. You don't want, the point mustn't be too long, but mustn't be too short. And I wouldn't say there is any particular hook. It just depends on what I'm tying. I'll tell you the hooks I like using. So I'm very fond of Hamakatsu C12s for little emergers. It's like a little scud hook, like a lightweight scud hook. For nymphs, Hamakatsu S10 2S. It's a fantastic little hook, beautiful. For dries, I use the S10, Hamakatsu S10. So for my stream fishing, those are basically the 3 hooks I use a lot. Occasionally, I use a streamer hook, especially for hoppers. I like, and terrestrials. I'll tie them on streamer hooks because they're bigger, bulkier, and you need that heavier hook. So yeah, I don't think you need 3,000 different hook types. I basically have 4 models of hooks I work with currently for the stuff I do. So yeah, keep it simple. Keep it simple.
Perfect. And Stan's saying yes, adding the worked. So thefeathermechanic.com. Then Rocky says, what made you decide to draw your own illustrations and step-by-step compared to the photo step-by-steps in the book?
Okay, so the thing with illustrations is you can manipulate an illustration. So you can basically mold the image to serve the purpose you need it to serve. Like for instance, I can make a parachute hackle way bigger than it really is to illustrate the point nicely. So the whole thing for me with the drawings was to show specific things, and sometimes it's difficult to do with a photo. I mean, I know that sounds weird, that a drawing can be clearer than an actual photo, but in many ways, like it, because you can sort of pull the viewer's focus in on specific things with a drawing, and it's not always that easy to do with a photo. Also, I just like the concept of looking at a drawing. A drawing, I don't know, a drawing. I love a drawing. I love a drawing. Love a drawing.
It's one of my favorite things about your book. Sebastian has a question. He said, it's an awe-inspiring presentation, Gordon. Thank you very much. Let me ask you, please, about the length you use in the dry fly tails to pose them the way you have shown us previously. Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
Sebastian from Patagonia.
Okay, so if you are tying conventional catskill type dry flies, right? Basically, generally the tail would be the length of the shank of the hook, sometimes slightly longer, and you need that tail to be that long so you can get that positioning of the fly. Now, I don't fish catskills a lot. Generally, I fish a lot of parachute style patterns. They're just a lot of advantages to them. With parachutes, the design of the parachute, basically, I would say you can get away with worse proportions. Like if your tail's slightly short, it's still going to fish the right way up because of the parachute, you know. Whereas on a catskill, if you tie that tail too short, it immediately will topple the fly over and it won't fish right. So parachutes are forgiving, you know, in terms of you can get it wrong and they'll still be effective. And yeah, so also tails, like if you look on nymphs, for instance, tails also translate into resistance. So the longer the tail, the more resistance on the sink. So if you look at these Euro nymphs, a lot of them have these short little tails. Why? Because you don't want that resistance. They need to get down. And the other thing is, you know, sorry, I'm just carrying on here, but the other thing is, traditionally we were taught that one needed to match the hatch the whole time. And matching the hatch is an important thing, but there isn't always a consistent hatch to match. And if you look at things like Euro nymphs, the majority of those things do not look like naturals. they do not. And this is the thing, April. Children put weird things in their mouths. I mean, you've got a daughter, right? So they're constantly putting little things in their mouths. Fish are exactly the same. The fish is sitting on the bottom there, and he mops little things up, and he goes, "Oh, that doesn't taste good," and he pops it up. Tuk, 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 tuk. You don't have to be matching the hatch the whole time. You know, when I was younger, I once caught a trout on a cigarette butt. I didn't have any dry flies. I stripped this little nymph, I put a cigarette butt, put it out, boom, fish. Trout are not smokers, but they will eat cigarette butts.
Right. So many great quotes in this. No, I love it. And someone said that they're waiting for your illustrations to come on your t-shirts. I think you need to do a series of t-shirts with your drawings and your quotes, especially, don't read books, read nature. I think that's golden.
So, no, like I've got this actor friend named Toby Cronje, and he's a Buddhist, right? And he said to me, he said, Gordon, in Buddhist philosophy, we believe that everything is interconnected. So the world is a bit like a spider web. If you pull on that string there, it affects the other side of the world. You are part of something else. You're not just this individual entity. You're just like part of a puzzle, and I can actually apply that to fishing as well. Be part of the puzzle. Blend in, get in there. We're so sometimes out of touch with the sort of, I almost want to say, the animal within you, because we've become so advanced. But in many ways, we've devolved, not evolved.
Yeah.
We've become cut off from nature. Cut off. If you look at children on cell phones all day, and they, I'm happy that my kids love fishing more than they love their cell phones, and that just makes me happy. So yeah.
Last question. Ken asks, when you're on the river and not having any luck, how often do you change your fly? And do you just change the size, or do you go to a different pattern?
Okay, Ken. Sometimes I just have a nap. Just, let me tell you what, fish are not always going to be accommodating. It does happen. It happens to the best of us. So what I will do is I will generally, at certain times of the day, I'll just take a nap. You get periods of the day where fish are slow. Then I'll take a nap. I won't fish the whole day. So yeah. But if you have limited fishing time and you have to fish the whole day, then chop and change. Ask yourself the question: where are these fish going to be? Why are they going to be there? And keep chopping and changing. I don't believe in doing the same thing over and over again without results. Why? It's pointless. If you don't get a fish within 10 minutes, something needs to change. So if you keep on changing and you keep on asking yourself, you will find yourself. Because then it's not just a mechanical thing you're doing. You're not just doing the same thing over and over and over again. You're chopping and changing. You're asking questions. People who achieve consistent results all do one thing: they ask the questions.
Yeah, I love it. Well, speaking of having a nap, it is now almost 3:30 in the morning for you.
Yes.
So we'll let you go to sleep. I cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your night to do this with us. And I hope that we see
I'm actually a vampire, so I'm about to go to work now, April.
Oh, good. Poor things. All right. Well, if anyone has any questions, you can find Gordon at thefeathermechanic.com. And you got some people saying thank you. Bianca, you're still awake too. My goodness, you're a real trooper. You have lots of thank yous. And I will get this up on, it'll be up on Facebook. And then I know it's easy to lose this. So I'll get this up on anchoredoutdoors.com. I will also send all of this over to Gordon so he has it on his end. And then between the two of us, you will be able to find it.
Can I give you one more thing?
Yeah.
Can I give them my email address?
Sure.
Okay, so my email address is Gordon, GORDON dot Vanderspui, VANDERSPUY @gmail.com. If you've got any questions or anything, this is what I love doing. Ask, and I will answer them.
Now you have it. You have direct access to them. So thank you very much. The book is incredible. Strongly recommend it. And Gordon, we'll see you soon. Thank you very much for everyone who tuned in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, April.
Thanks, Gordon. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.